Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's first webinar of the academic year with Ivana Bartoletti and Elizabeth Denham CBE, the UK Information Commissioner, for this discussion, A New Bretton Woods for Data. We're fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose questions using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. Questions will be visible to all attendees and can be upvoted and commented upon, and we will endeavour to follow up any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Ivana Bartoletti, Visiting Policy Fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute and also Technical Director, Privacy, Deloitte. Ivana, welcome.
Thank you so much, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcoming so many of you to this discussion today. I'm particularly happy because to host this as a visiting policy fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute, because it's an absolutely fantastic place for exploring some of the greatest challenges at the intersection of the digital politics and the law. And I'm delighted that we are joined by Elizabeth Denham, the UK's Information Commissioner. There is absolutely little doubt that Elizabeth has been leading from the front of very extraordinary times for Britain and from the world. And I really think, and I really want to praise her for this leadership. And this is the very leadership that Elizabeth is showing now on this very complex matter that we will be discussing today. So before I hand over to Elizabeth, I just would like to quickly set the scene. It is great that we have over 400 people registered for today, and from all different backgrounds, from all different walks of life, and actually from all over the world. And this is certainly testament to how important this issue is to the economy, health, human rights, and international relations. So data sharing is really a key topic these days. Whether it's about localization, artificial intelligence, trade, privacy, data sharing is not just about agreements to ensure the flow of data and situations hindering them. In fact, I'm actually convinced that data sharing has to do more with geopolitics than with the law. And geopolitical issues require a very strong geopolitical answer. To me, the first step of a political answer is that we must rethink the concept of sovereignty. And over the last few years, technical and digital sovereignty has become very much of a buzzword. It has entered the vocabulary of legislators and underpins national strategies across the world. The term sovereignty reflects a country's ambition to exercise control over global processes of technological development. So in very recent times, sovereignty has become aligned with the broader notion of autonomy. But this concept of autonomy has been building alongside technological development, the increase of computational power and the speeding up of the adoption of artificial intelligence. And we have seen countries around the world equipping themselves with data strategies to build this technological autonomy, and by doing so, win the global race of innovation. But the more we advance technologically, the more we realize that sovereignty as autarky is not possible due to the nature of the global supply chain. It is not by coincidence that microchips is one of the hottest geopolitical issues we're facing right now. A technological one, certainly, but also a geopolitical one too, especially as we are seeing an increase in regulatory supply chain control used as weapons for technology competition against companies and countries. So here are the two paradoxes. First, international trade agreements are the most effective approach to secure technological sovereignty. But what is required for these trade agreements is exactly the opposite of sovereignty, and that is the global structures and global organizations. And second, we are seeing a real proliferation of privacy laws and all around the world. The most recently, privacy law has been enacted in China and has furthered China's role as a global player. The more we enact privacy laws, the less we are able to share information globally. The more we identify a convergence around individuals' control over their data, the more we seem to be enabled to identify a trust-based system to share information. the reality is that regulating data is not easy. People say that data is the new oil, but that is very misleading because data is not a tangible asset. And as an intangible one, it does not fit the traditional avenues we use, for example, in commerce. The language of trade agreement, for example, might be too far from the complexity around security, human rights, and law access that data sharing presents. For this reason, I strongly believe that a new vision is necessary. And this is why I'm so proud to now hand over to Elizabeth Denham. Here you are.
Here I am. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I think the provocation that you have laid before me for my keynote speech this afternoon, I very much appreciate the invitation to speak to all of you today. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to tell a story for the beginning of my prepared remarks this afternoon. So let's think back to July of 1944, when the world was still at war. Allied forces were fighting to liberate France, with Paris still occupied by German troops. Battles in the Pacific would continue for another year. But in New Hampshire, in the US, the mood was a little bit different. There at the foot of the White Mountains and beneath the chandeliers of the recently repainted Mount Washington Hotel, economists gathered in wicker chairs to smoke, to deliberate, and to consider how the world should be rebuilt once the war ended. The delegates at the Bretton Woods conference were a bit of an eclectic group. The chief American negotiator would later be accused of being a Soviet spy. And the economist, John Maynard Keynes, represented Britain. And at times he was holding court from his hotel bed as he struggled with ill health. The Chinese delegate is reported to have focused all of his energies on throwing the best parties in the hotel. And yet within weeks, this group reached a series of agreements that continue to influence our world today, including the formation of the IMF and the World Bank. Where the delegates succeeded was in appreciating that the challenges that individual states faced in rebuilding and refinancing their own nations could only be resolved with an international solution. And as the US Treasury Secretary put it, the only genuine safeguard for our national interests lies in international cooperation. And my suggestion today is that the challenges that we are facing are not comparable with that period in history. For all of the difficulties that we have endured through the pandemic, our world is more stable and it's more prosperous. But as I want to set out today, the value of international cooperation continues to be fundamental. Our current approach to data protection, considered nation by nation, can only take us so far. If we are to unlock the full potential of data-driven innovation supported by public trust in how data is used, we need an international approach to data protection standards. We need an international solution. We need a data Bretton Woods. And I've worked in data protection in one way or another for over 4 decades. I began my career in the dusty record rooms at the city of Richmond in Canada as a professional archivist, and I saw firsthand how history shapes our present. And my career developed first as a privacy coordinator in the health sector, and then moving on into the world of regulation. And often that work was still in those dusty back rooms. And that's where data protection lived into the early 2000s. Our work as data protection experts, as regulators, was really just one of legal compliance or ticking boxes. The world feels very different today. Data protection had come out of the shadows before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, the benefit of data protection truly shone through. When the government in the UK wanted to develop a contact tracing app, it considered data protection at an early stage of the development. It consulted with my office. And it was very clear from the outset of those discussions that the government understood that by answering the questions that we posed about transparency and legality and necessity and fairness, the final product would then be trusted by the people they hoped would use the app. And we saw a similar situation around data sharing to benefit vulnerable people who were shielding during the pandemic. Public authorities held data about who was shielding. Supermarkets wanted to help by dedicating those scarce delivery slots to those that needed them most. So a successful partnership was made possible through consideration of data protection. But there's a fundamental problem here. Amid this recognition of the value of data protection, our digital world is international. Data flows around the world happen in a heartbeat. I open up my phone, I check an app, and in a nanosecond, my data travels around the globe. Services like geolocation and cloud computing all rely on international data flows. But the checks and balances on this data are domestic. And that brings problems. It means then that when a multinational company doesn't follow the rules, or when there's an international data breach, the ability for regulators to work together across jurisdictions can be limited as we try to match up our different legal systems and our different approaches. It means that there are companies who develop apps available to people in the UK, but based in jurisdictions with little or no data protection provisions. And it means that our system for international data flows is based on assessments of how other nations' laws measure up to our own, no matter how many flaws we may be willing to acknowledge in our own systems. So I have to pause here to acknowledge the great work that's being done already to reduce these problems. The ambition of data-free flows with trust was made a central part of the 2019 G20 meeting by the then Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. And speaking in Tokyo at a side event at that G20, I spoke about my hope that we could make progress by working with difference, celebrating our differing laws, cultures, and outlooks, but building bridges between them. And that's been the central work, the central philosophy of the Global Privacy Assembly, which I chair. And that group now brings together more than 130 authorities, regulators, members from around the world to encourage greater collaboration and cooperation. And I would say we've seen real progress through the Assembly, particularly around regulatory cooperation, for instance, in response to the COVID pandemic. And only this week, my G7 counterparts met to consider how we could find ways for existing regimes to work together more closely. And that aim of data free flow with trust remains central, and the ambition within that group remains clear. I also think it's fair to praise the UK government for taking an international approach here too, particularly in recognizing international partnerships are the key to unlocking the full opportunities that data offers the UK economy. Hell, they've even recommended another internationalist to be the successor, my successor in this role. But all of this work, from the GPA to the G7, only goes so far. And ultimately, it feels as though a more ambitious approach, a new approach, is needed. This is, after all, an international problem that could be costing economies around the world billions of pounds. Recent estimates suggest as much as 11 billion pounds worth of trade goes unrealized around the world due to barriers associated with data transfers. And as many of you know, the transfer of data between countries is typically limited to where those nations have agreed that they share a similar standard of data protection. The assessment of which countries have high enough standards of data protection, standards are known as adequacy assessments. For instance, the EU's GDPR sets a consistent standard of data protection across the Union and then allows for data to flow outside of the Union to countries whose data protection standards the EU considers to be essentially equivalent to their own. The EU recently granted adequacy to the UK and already has agreements in place with the likes of Japan and New Zealand. And you may have seen the UK making its own announcements in this field last month, setting out the first countries that the UK will consider when granting its own adequacy agreements. These adequacy agreements provide clear benefits. Data can fuel economic growth, digital innovation, and more efficient public services. And adequacy agreements remove the barriers for organizations to take an international mindset, whether that's in attracting new customers, working with partners, or looking for backroom efficiencies. But there are challenges associated with this approach too. The first one is considering another's law, whether or not that law offers the same protection as your own is a complex process. Countries' laws reflect their histories, their culture, their societies. Trust in police access to information can be low in countries that historically had secret police forces with government links, for instance. And there is a difference between a European approach founded in human rights versus a North American approach, which is historically centered on consumer rights. And as you mentioned in your introduction, throw geopolitics into the mix, and it's no surprise that adequacy assessments can be far from simple. We note that even when agreed, these adequacy agreements can prove fragile. We have seen the EU's partnership with the US falter on several occasions amid concern over the collection and analysis of data by intelligence services. Where agreements appear vulnerable to court challenge, they fail to offer the surety that businesses crave. And finally, relying on adequacy agreements alone leaves nations with a binary choice. A country's data protection regime is good enough, or it's not. It emphasizes the differences between our approaches and leaves the overwhelming majority of countries outside the tent. And that feels like a significant handbrake on digital innovation. Data can still be transferred to the long list of companies without agreements, but the responsibility is on the individual organizations to keep data protected, a process that is cumbersome, labor-intensive, and costly. And again, it's difficult to shake the sense of a series of domestic solutions being applied to try to solve an international problem. Which is where we return to Bretton Woods. The 1944 conference was attended by 730 delegates from almost 50 nations around the world. And that group included economists, politicians, subject specialists. Delegates came from diverse cultures and brought diverse ideas, but with a united understanding. The old system had failed, and a new one built on international cooperation was needed. It's my view that a Bretton Woods conference for data is required today. It is accepted that the digital world is borderless. It's accepted that the flow of data from individual to organization, from organization to organization, and from country to country is integral to digital innovation. And it is accepted, I hope, that such data flows rely on public trust earned through sensible data protection regulation. And yet, we continue to consider those protections domestically, and that needs to change. So let's be clear from the outset. This is not about creating a global law that everyone should follow, must follow. It's not about deciding that there is one law to rule them all. As I said at the G20 in Japan, we will only make progress by respecting the differences between our laws, our cultures, and our societies. We need to build the architecture to allow those differences to work side by side. Or to put it another way, every country should be able to choose its own taps. We just need to find a way to get the pipes and the plumbing to better join them all together so that we can maximize the data flow. A Bretton Woods conference could provide the melting pot of ideas needed to take forward. It could consider how best to provide that plumbing. And my own view is that a global data protection accord could find common ground between nations' data protection regimes. Memberships would rely on countries demonstrating their commitment to data protection, backed by independent regulation. And organizations within those member nations would be able to transfer low-risk data to countries who were fellow members. And crucially, the bar for membership would be lower than adequacy. Membership of a global data protection accord would not require companies to demonstrate their law offered the same safeguards as, say, the GDPR. Businesses would benefit from the certainty of a system less vulnerable to legal challenge and much broader than partnerships with individual nations. And consumers would know that simple protections were in place for their data around the globe. So that's one idea. But to quote the man who contributed so much to the original Bretton Woods conference, John Maynard Keynes, the difficulty lies not in the new ideas, but in escaping the old ones. And that's the challenge. I know that the data protection community is ready to be part of a solution. I see that in my work with the GPA, and I see the ambition when I talk to my G7 colleagues. But that challenge must now go further. The challenge must go to governments and international organizations like the OECD, the Council of Europe, the WTO. They're the ones with the convening power to make a Bretton Woods for data actually happen. And then the challenge has to go further afield. Data is such a broad, cross-societal issue that impacts every facet of our lives. And so the solutions need to come from the bright minds, from civil society, from think tanks, from academia, from business, and from people whose trust so much relies on. So the challenge is clear. The appetite for the solutions is clear. What we need now is 21st century thinking for a 21st century problem. So there's my provocation to you all this afternoon, and I'm very much looking forward to a dialogue.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was absolutely great. And I think you are completely right. I mean, we need to identify modern solutions to fit the problems as they are now and the challenges as they are now. I wanted to ask you a question, and then also we can give more people to put their questions in the chat. But I just wanted to ask you one thing to start with, which is I came into privacy law years ago through a human rights background. And one of the fears I've always had around sort of data localization, the drive to hold data in one country, has always been around human rights, the need for that global oversight. That is so important, because not having that international oversight, then it's not good. It's not conducive to the respect of the human rights. So I wonder whether we could bring that angle into consideration. So you mentioned that we need different actors in this, and we need sort of that global to set up a new global arena to allow this conversation to happen. And I wonder whether we could bring that dimension as well, because one of the key things that's become very clear to me over the years is that without that sort of oversight, without the ability of others to scrutinize what happens, then what is it countries that have got that we can end up in a more problematic situations for the use and handling of data from a human rights perspective. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about this.
I absolutely agree that some of the challenges affecting human rights, fairness in our societies are coming out of data localization. So if we were deciding a new system that allowed data to flow with responsibility, with safeguards, with protection, then I don't think the individual nations would default to data localization. So that's one of the reasons why I think a new system is needed, and we really need a melting pot of ideas to get there, because what is happening is as you said, more and more privacy laws, data protection laws are being passed around the world. And what we see is the unfortunate default of data localization. And that means there isn't the kind of scrutiny and awareness and protection of human rights. So I think it's an extremely valuable point. If we had a blank sheet of paper and we were designing a system, we would not be designing it in the way that the laws have driven data localization. So it's a big concern.
Thank you. I see there is quite a few questions now, and I see there are a few questions that converge around one topic, which is how do we square your call for a new global approach with the reality today of a very fragmented international scenario. So, for example, there is a question here, says, thank you for your enlightening words. We have seen this kind of proposals for a global solution in the industry through Microsoft, for example. However, international cooperation is a risk nowadays. What can we do to foster this cooperation and prompt global negotiations towards an international agreement on this data flow theme? Should we work through with the UN? Should our approach, but yeah, so that is the question. Sorry, I couldn't read the final sentence, and there are a few questions around this. So there's a dichotomy, to an extent. Some viewers are saying, we are sort of championing this sort of global approach, and at the same time, though, we live in a very fragmented sort of geopolitical scenario.
I agree that we live in a fragmented world right now, political world right now, but we do have some things that draw us together. And I think that people around the world, individual consumers, individual citizens, expect greater respect for their personal information. And where I see convergence around the world, it's people's expectations. And when UK citizens and EU citizens have new rights to be able to exercise when it comes to their personal data, then US citizens are saying, why don't we have the right to port our data? Why don't we have the right to access our data? Why don't we have an independent oversight agency that we can go to? Why are we forced through the courts? So I see consistency and convergence in what people expect around the world. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think the G20 meeting in Japan in 2019 and the G7 meetings that are happening and coalescing around this theme of data-free flows with trust are a really important start. This week, it's the first time that the G7 counterparts, my counterparts, met to try to break down some of the barriers. So I'm hopeful that we can get there, but in the meantime, we continue to drive forward in finding international solutions, and many bodies are involved in that. Council of Europe, the OECD, I think their project is really important, looking at government access to private sector data. So there's a lot of work going on, but I worry that we're not actually looking at a brand new system, as opposed to just trying to bring along our old way of thinking of making judgments about others' protections. And I think that needs to stop, and we need to bring the world together.
Thank you. There are, again, sort of another cluster of questions around, for example, the fact that it's taken so long to, for example, achieve the GDPR, and so what are we going to expect? Sort of what times are we looking at? What it's taken so long for the GDPR, and so it could take even longer for something like this. And then there is a question in particular that focuses on the Convention 108. The first legally binding international instrument in the data protection field is now ratified by 47 members states, stretching far beyond the EU. The GDPR was only finalized 5 years ago. These are modern data processing rights-based solutions. What are concrete examples that Ms. Denham thinks are not? So if there is any comments on this.
Yeah, I do think that the Convention 108 and 108 Plus is an important standard. But again, I think that it reflects some older way of thinking. So that's why I'm saying we need to have an international organization convene an inclusive discussion, dialogue, melting pot of ideas, and not just with nation states, but with civil society and academia and economists and others, to really have a conversation about where we see the global digital economy going in the future. So I worry that some of these other initiatives are a patchwork of just slowly changing laws. Use the GDPR as an example. The GDPR is not a perfect law, but it's the most modern law that took the best hits of various laws around the world and put them into the most recent law. So, I mean, there's standards in the GDPR that actually are principles that American law has had in place for a long time, Canadian law, Australia law, UK law, etc. So the GDPR is not an EU created law. It's really a conglomeration of the best practices and the best of other laws around the world. So I guess what I'm saying is a Bretton Woods for data would be a new and inclusive conversation about where the protection for the digital of citizens in the digital economy goes next.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I agree, and I also wanted to move to another sort of topic that is often mentioned in these questions, which is around if we want to make this participatory, because you mentioned something really important here, which is sort of the citizens' involvement into this, the fact that privacy has become an issue that people talk about these days at a kitchen table. And it didn't used to be like this. I mean, I'm surprised that, over sort of 20 years career in this field, I mean, things like, privacy but even more, niche issues like algorithmic bias and all these issues that we deal with, they've now become mainstream and people talk about them at a kitchen table. So there are some questions in here which speak to the point of how do we make sure that we have a participatory project around this. And there is a question in particular, which is around, which basically is really asks you about, I found it earlier, which I thought was interesting, was about how do we make sure that there is a participation from different sort of professions, different people, different backgrounds? How do we make sure that we involve individuals and organizations into this? But also, how do we make sure this is not just a top-down approach, but there is also a bottom-up approach? And the questions that I was referring to, which I now cannot find, was really about how, for example, DLT and new technologies can play a part into this. If we can explore new technologies that can enable a more participatory enjoyment of privacy.
Those are a great set of questions, but I completely agree with you that privacy came to be pretty much mainstream in 2018. I'm going to put a date on it. And I think that's when the GDPR came into effect, but it was also when some large investigations by journalists and by data protection authorities revealed that the same data analytics and AI methodology that was selling us cars and trainers was now influencing the way that we may vote or not vote. And I do think that privacy was mainstream. It was discussed around the dinner table. I do think that people are more engaged in their privacy rights now than we've ever seen. The other issue is if we think about what's happened with the pandemic. I mean, in January of 2020, if you had said to me that I would be opining on proximity apps with my health data, or opining on certification schemes to be able to get on an airplane or go into a bar, and if no one could have predicted the kind of acceleration in the deployment of new technologies and people's acceptance of giving more data for the public good. So I would say that that is another reason why people need to be engaged in this conversation. And when I go back to the idea that I'm putting forward, saying we need a Bretton Woods for data, it has to involve different sectors, different professions. It has to involve people, because data is part of everybody's daily existence, and people care more than they ever have. And you've been around this field for a long time to know when it was a pretty dusty back room area of law or area of education.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I mean, what has changed is that I think now more than ever, if people are given a choice, they make a choice previously. So the question is more about where they're given that choice. But I wanted to pick up on a few other questions that we have here, and I'm really glad that there are so many. So for example, there are questions around how do we reconcile what are essentially differences in the ethics underpinning the laws in different jurisdictions. In Europe, we draw the basis of rights as we share dignity and humanity, but that is not shared elsewhere. I mean, and this is a really interesting point. You touched on it quite a lot, you know, said we are different, you know, laws respect and reflect what the country's history and all of that. But there is convergences, isn't there? I mean, if we look at some of the global laws that we have on privacy, the national laws that we have on privacy, there is convergence, but how can we build that sort of joint approach, and what is required for that in your view?
I think there's a convergence on principles, not necessarily laws, but I think there's a convergence on what people's expectations are, the kinds of protections that they want to see in place wherever they live. There's a recognition and I think a reality that wherever we are in the world, our data could be launched with an app that, you know, that we don't know where the data is. So therefore, I think the expectations of digital citizens is protection, and protection with international independent oversight and action. So data protection authorities are coming closer and closer together when it comes to joint enforcement and collaboration in enforcement, because again, we're also dealing with companies, the likes of which we've never seen before, global tech companies, where citizens' data is collected and shared. The other thing I wanted to say is, I mean, I'm really proud of a piece of work that our office has done to better protect children online. So on September 2nd, our children's code, the Age Appropriate Design Code, which is a regulatory, statutory code, went live. And in the week or so before that regulation, that code went live, we saw significant changes being put in place by the big tech companies, and they rolled it out not just in the UK, but they rolled out these protections to all children around the world. And so I think that privacy by design approach is important. I also think the tech companies are changing. I think they do realize that their users around the world expect protection, even if the local laws don't. So I do think that's a significant change that we've seen only in the past few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming to sort of the tricky sort of elements of all this, you know, which is around the tricky, what I mean is that we've been discussing a lot, right, sort of surveillance, you know, and the fact that the extraterritoriality, for example, of US surveillance is one question here, which is, it says, just going to read it out. It says, the extraterritoriality of US surveillance laws remains the key enduring roadblock for inadequacy stated with the GDPR. Is it realistic to expect any significant reform of these laws in the context of an international conference? Are there not reason to fear that their persistence will rather compel some multinational firms to create independent local subsidiaries, thereby further fragmenting data flows?
I'm not naive to the challenge of what I'm suggesting here, but we have seen the world come together to deal with challenges in other areas of law, in other areas of policy, of public policy. So we've seen it around criminality, where the world has come together because they realize that crime knows no borders, and therefore we need collaboration and we need standards. We've seen that on copyright as well. I mean, I think that the work that the OECD is doing right now on advocating and creating standards for government access to private sector data is a really important piece of work. And I think that's part of what I'm calling for here, which is a rethinking of data flows with trust around the world and the kind of international oversight that we need.
Thank you. Got 10 minutes for a few more questions. There is one here, I'm going to, from the top. Oh, there's an interesting question from saying ethnographers and anthropologists, can we use their expertise to create an understanding of public and private space? That's a little bit alongside, the idea that we need to respect the so different cultures and what is underpinning.
I think that's a really good example of the kind of expertise and different sectors, different voices, and an inclusive dialogue that we need to put into place. It's not just a trade issue. This is not just a trade issue. This is an issue that touches on, as you say, security and human rights and the digital economy. This is such a broad issue that we need to bring all of the experts to the table.
I'm going to fire a few more questions. So there's one here that says, are you suggesting that any data protection accord would look to find common ground by suggesting data protection standards that are less stringent than the GDPR?
I'm saying that the GDPR is not the standard around the world. I think we have to find convergence in the principles, and we should formulate an agreement among member states so that data can flow, therefore moving away from the kind of judgment calls that we're making on other laws. That's what I'm saying. The GDPR doesn't have to be the standard around the world. I mean, it's not even now. You see that Europe has adequacy arrangements with Canada, with Israel, with New Zealand, with the UK, and all of those laws look different than the GDPR.
Another question here, would China be in your Bretton Woods?
I don't think we can leave China out of the Bretton Woods. I mean, China's just passed a data protection law, but I'm arguing for a discussion that needs to be a global and inclusive discussion. I'm not saying it's easy, but I mean, we're talking about the different standards when it comes to surveillance. We're talking about different standards when it comes to artificial intelligence. You mentioned that in your opening. So, I mean, I'm not the designer. I'm not the designer of Bretton Woods, but I'm saying it needs to be inclusive. And inclusiveness can be built incrementally. So when I say the G20 and the G7 is a good start to this dialogue, eventually, though, we're going to have to deal with some of those broader geopolitical questions, as you raised at the beginning of this session.
Couple more questions. There's one here saying the data default to localization is because of the US failure to respect human rights and state surveillance. Surely the solution is to resolve the failures of international law and data protection law enforcement and surveillance, not to ignore those and patch over the symptoms, which is, I think you've addressed that. If there's anything you want to add, but I
mean, no, I agree. I think data localization is it's the wrong outcome of the creation of data protection laws, and that's why I think we have to move away and look towards an international approach to data protection laws. Otherwise, they default to data localization.
Another question saying, isn't GDPR effectively the very gold standard Bretton Woods sought to achieve? Isn't coming up with a different and potentially weaker set of global adequacy standards actually the equivalent of Bretton Woods ditching the gold standards in 1973 and therefore ending?
I think, as I said, I think GDPR is a law that works well in the EU. Obviously, the UK has the GDPR as well, but other laws have already been found to be equivalent to the GDPR. So it's not as if the GDPR is the law and the gold standard around the world. I think we have to find new ways to find our commonality and establish a global instrument that we can all sign up to. Bretton Woods could be a common baseline, and that's what I said in my speech. GDPR is well above that, but GDPR is a law that is set to cover all processing contexts. And I think that is a really important point too.
Absolutely. There's a question here which is a bit broader than this, which is around whether is our framing of personal data fit for future purposes? If we are going to globally frame data subject rights, then does Elizabeth agree that we need to abandon framing of personal data as property, appear, fuel, and reframe as data that is indivisible from our real life personas, digital descendants, as I have framed it elsewhere? Otherwise, are we not working to optimize exploitation?
I think I would throw that question back to you. And I think that's why we need academics and experts and technologists to contribute to this, because our definition of personal data will change with the deployment of new technologies. So I would come to the Oxford Internet Institute and ask for advice in that. So reframing what personal data is, what personally identifiable information is part of the puzzle. And I'm not naive in thinking that a Bretton Woods for data will take years. But even if we had a pathway forward using some of the immediate initiatives, the Global Privacy Assembly, the G7, the G20, the OECD, but we don't have a conversation that pulls all of those pathways forward to an inclusive standard setting exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a follow-up on that from it's really weird, Elizabeth, because when I look at this question, they seem them to move around. So I start reading one and then it disappears. So there is a question here. I think you answered, so who should be the initiator and designer of the Bretton Woods for data? So you mentioned sort of global organizations, so moving as a starting point, from the existing sort of organizations and then expand from that. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, the question is work with who? And I said that data protection authorities are not fussy, but it needs to be a convener who has the power to bring governments to the table, to bring citizens to the table, to bring experts to the table. So, I think our Global Privacy Assembly of oversight agencies is an important voice, but we're not the convener. We're not the policymakers.
Yeah. And the final question I'm going to take, which is if countries and regions continue to impose their regulations based on extraterritorial basis, we cannot foster international cooperation. Is it about competition on technological supremacy supported by regulation or a true cooperation?
I'll throw that question back to you, because you started in your introduction about competition. Is it not all about global competition for digital markets? So I would ask you for your view on that question.
I mean, I think to me that goes at the heart of the problem. I mean, my work and the things that I try to explore are really about that, and whether and I do view and sort of all sort of the policies and politics and geopolitics around data as some of the crucial issues that we have to discuss. And yes, I mean, I really think, and I'm even more convinced now because you've really touched on some really, really good points. I'm really even more convinced that we are dealing with an urgent geopolitical issue here, and it's something that, as you say, does require a global approach, does require us shaking the way that we've been thinking and conceiving things so far.
Yeah, I think we just need to think anew. We've got new technologies. We've had an incredible acceleration of the deployment of new technologies through the pandemic. The time is right, and it's urgently needed for us to have an inclusive dialogue about the future of data. And I think Bretton Woods is it's an example.
Well, I really thank you for being with us today. I really look forward to what are the next steps in this direction, how we can move things forward and really try and contribute and initiate as many discussions around this that are absolutely necessary. And I'm sure that we'll be finding a lot of people from different backgrounds, different walks of life that are really keen to see this moving forward.
And some of them were here today with their excellent questions. So
absolutely. So thanks to you, Elizabeth. Thanks to everyone for attending, and to the Oxford Internet Institute for hosting this. And I'm going to hand over back to Mark.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth and Ivana, for your time and expertise today. That was a fascinating talk. We'll send out a follow-up email from the session to those who attended, including a link to the recording. And please visit our website and follow us on social media for announcements of our autumn term events program, which will be published in the coming weeks. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.